Well, being involved in the Apollo 11 first landing on the moon was really a thrill for me. I was in mission control. I was the CAPCOM, the capsule communicator, and the only person in mission control that was talking to them during the descent. Though you have a room full of people, only the CAPCOM can speak to the crew. So it was a real exciting time. It was the first attempt to make a landing on the moon, and so everybody was really focused, keyed up, excited. But as the descent continued, it became more and more tense in mission control because of a series of problems. But Apollo 11 to me was the ultimate space flight. First time anybody was going to ever attempt to land on another heavenly body. It was only the third time we'd been to the moon, and this opportunity to be the first to step onto the moon for our country was a very moving experience, and I think a very meaningful experience, and something that will be in the history books forever.
You're in that room. There was a lot of work that went into that day, but once you're in that room and you're sitting, you take your seat and you put the headphones on, what did it feel like in there?
Well, we were excited, of course. This is it. With no simulation anymore. We were prepared. Gene Kranz, the flight director, said, lock the door, nobody leaves and nobody comes in from this point on. And he gave us a little speech. Everybody keep focused. You remember, this can be just like a simulation, but it's for the real. And so everybody be on your P's and Q's and be alert. And so he gave us a pep talk, and so everybody was agreeable. And so as we started down, I'd say the room was very, very focused and not quiet. There was not much talk in the room. Like a lot of times there's a lot of side chatter you can hear in one ear. It's a flight director loop. But this was only the serious conversations that you had to have.
The conversations that you have the headphones on. Who was in the you have obviously Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and was he in between Neil and Michael Collins? And who did you speak to first when they first get in the capsule?
Well, in the lunar module, the lunar module pilot floats in first and starts the power up. Then the commander comes in, leaving Mike Collins, the command module pilot, in the other spacecraft. At this time, we split up, so there was a CAPCOM for Collins, and I was the CAPCOM for the lunar module. So as Buzz powered up, one of the first things he did was get the communications loop up, powered up, batteries, and then he starts powering up the rest of the spacecraft. Neil Armstrong floats in. The first person I spoke to was, of course, Buzz Aldrin, because he was the first one into the lunar module and powering up. Then Neil floats over, and they began to basically activate the lunar module. So we were communicating to both of them as he was doing one system, power up, and Aldrin was doing another system power up. So you sort of interface with both crewmen during the power up and the activation.
Yeah, Michael Collins had to be in the separate spacecraft.
At this point, they had not separated. They were in separate spacecraft, but they were still joined up.
What was your first words to? So, give us the most critical time. It was because I guess it didn't go exactly as planned, right? There was some moments there where they might have come in early and landed when. What happened?
The activation and power up went really right according to plan. They had no problems as they powered up. The systems all checked out. They got their platform aligned correctly. We were able to separate right on schedule, and I believe that Mike Collins in the command module had to do an orbit burn to change his orbit so he would be in the right phasing if they had to abort and run for rendezvous. And so they were floating free, if you will, after Mike let them go. And so they backed off and pitched up, and there's some pictures from the command module of them floating free, if you will. And everything was really perfect shape at this point. I think we had an orbit or two as they were continuing their power up and we were getting everything ready to land. And then, so everything was right on. I remember Neil saying it looked like to us, he had some orbital maps and he was windows down, so he was checking his position, and he thought he was a little too far down. I think it was far down range than he should have been. But we weren't really worried about that at that point. And so we started our descent, and then I'll use the term, things started coming unglued in the lunar module. We first had communication problems. So we had a couple antennas that we had to get repointed at the spacecraft. One of the mission rules, if you lose data for, let's say, 30 seconds or a minute during descent, you got to abort. So you can't land without mission control having the data. So it was critical we reestablished the downlink from the spacecraft, which we did. And we gave Buzz the angles that he had to dial in to point the antenna right, and it came back, dropped out, came back, and then things got that established, and all of a sudden we had a computer alarm of 1201. Well, that really got my attention and everybody else in the room. It was, without the computer, you don't land. You have to abort. So was this a go or no go? And fortunately, our guidance guys, Steve Bales and a guy in the back room named Jack Garman, had a chart of every computer alarm. And if this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. If this happens, this means that. And so it wasn't but just a few seconds to Steve Bales actually hollered, "We're go on that alarm flight." So I sort of preempted Gene Kranz, and I just hollered to the crew, "We're go on that alarm." And
then you had 60 seconds, right?
Oh, that was later on.
Yeah.
That came later. But anyway, that was the computer, and we kept going. We kept having these alarms, and then at 7,000 feet, the vehicle pitches over. They see the landing spots for the first time, and Neil realized the trajectory's in the wrong spot, and so he can't land there, so he levels off, I think about 400 or 500 feet, and flies horizontally across the moon for about 2 or 3 miles, let's say.
How far above the moon?
About 400 or 500 feet.
Wow.
And it's in a big boulder field. So we had communication, then we had computer problems, then we have a trajectory problem. So when he leveled off, that required a lot of extra fuel to fly horizontally. And then when he gets there, gets to a spot he thinks he can land, he pitches up, slows his forward velocity, and then starts down like a helicopter, basically. And so that we got down to minimum fuel, and which was, I think, 4%. And the propulsion flight controller said 60 seconds flight, and flight said 60 seconds. I called the crew 60 seconds, which they had 60 seconds to land, and we were going to call an abort in mission control. So you can imagine the tension building in the room. It was really, really tense. Everybody's so focused. And then they weren't on the ground, and 30 seconds later we called Eagle 30 seconds. But they were close, but not on the ground. 13 seconds later, though, I heard Buzz Aldrin say, "Contact, engine stop," and we were on the moon. And a great sigh of relief. We looked at one another. Jim Lovell was to my left. He was the backup commander, and he was to the left. And we big smiles, and but it was like somebody, the tension in Michigan control is like a big balloon about to pop, and somebody that landed, when he said engine stop, it was like somebody punched the button and all the tension left the room, and we breathed a sigh of relief. A few seconds later, Neil comes back and said, "Houston Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." And my response came from my heart because it was the truth. I said, "Roger, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." And I really believe we were all holding our breath. I know I was. And but then then we still had to stay focused because you hit the moon and you spring a leak or a battery drops off, or a tank starts to leak, and you got to be ready to lift off again.
Yeah.
So,
was there enough fuel? You said you had used some of the fuel to actually make that low trajectory run at the last minute that he had to do. Were you concerned there was enough fuel to get you back?
No, it was the Ascent engine had a totally different set of fuel tanks and oxidizers. So you never use that on the descent. It's impossible to use the Ascent fuel on the descent. The minimum in the descent engine was 4%. That was to be used if you weren't landing and you had an abort, let's say 3,000 feet up. You throttled up and you use that fuel to get you climbing away from the moon to a safe altitude, and then you abort stage, the Ascent engine ignited, and then you went back into orbit. So that 4% fuel from 20 feet off the moon, you could use that to land. And I'm convinced that Neil Armstrong had the prerogative, if we'd have called an abort at 30 feet, he would have ignored that and said, "I'm landing." So he had 4% left.
Yeah, because they'd gone all that way. He
wasn't going to abort from 20 feet.
I guess at that point you think the mission is more important than your life. And
I don't think that was his thought, but 4%'s a lot of fuel at 10% power.
Sure.
And so he had maybe a minute or so more in that 4% to actually land the vehicle. So from 100 feet down, that 4% gave you enough fuel to go ahead and continue your descent.
So it lands. Now, how long before they actually stepped out of the vehicle from the moment it touched down and the dust was?
Well, we got them to us. We had stays, we call it, no stay, no stay, T1, T2, T3. And I don't remember the exact times, but T1 like maybe 5 minutes after touchdown. T2 at a certain number, and then T3 was maybe an hour later. And everything looked good. We got it powered down, and we were stay. And so we left. Our shift left, and another shift came on to be there for the actual moonwalk. So Bruce McCandless took over my job as CAPCOM. We had a new flight director who I don't recall that was, but the whole team, our team left and they came in.
So give me an idea then, Charlie. So when they take off from Houston, or Cape Canaveral, right?
Yeah, Kennedy Space Center.
Kennedy Space Center. They take off, and how long did it take to get up there and actually land? How many hours?
It was over 3 days. The trajectory on the Apollo was, you went in orbit at 100 miles, still attached to the third stage of the Saturn V. You orbited the Earth 1.5 times. If everything worked out was okay, you fired the engine, and left Earth orbit. You accelerated to 25,000 miles an hour, which was escape velocity, and off you went. But the trajectory for Apollo to intercept the moon was 3 days. And that trajectory was set by the amount of fuel you had on board the spacecraft. You could get to the moon a lot faster, but you're going so fast when you get there, you didn't have enough fuel to slow down, get in orbit, and then enough to come home.
The new crew comes in to replace you.
Yeah.
Did you stick around to see what they said once and him stepping onto the moon?
I was home with my family watching on the black and white TV. Yeah. After we got off duty, we went over and had a big press conference, of course. Then everybody went into the swinging door somewhere, had a beer,
sure,
celebrated, and then we went home. And so I was watching on TV with my young kids and my wife.
So was it an hour before they were allowed to come out of the capsule and step onto the moon?
It's probably a little bit more than that.
A little bit more than an hour.
They were already in the spacesuits, so they had to just put on the backpack, put on the moon boots, put on the moon exterior gloves, and as they depressurized the spacecraft, the suits started to inflate. Then they had a pressure check in the suits, and all that. Probably, I don't remember, but for us, when we started from scratch with no suits on, it was 3 hours.
So Neil said, so he steps, you're there watching at home on your black and white TV. You see him step, you see him. You just got him there.
Yeah.
So now you're at home and you see him step on. You get a double celebration, or a double, 2 birthday cakes in one day.
Exactly.
What did you jump out of your chair? What did you do the moment he put his foot down? Like, it was left foot. He puts it down on the surface. What did you do? And he says that historic line, one small step.
I just looked at my wife and says, we did it. We did the landing on the moon. We accomplished the goal that Kennedy gave us in 8 years and 2 months. We did it. And so it was a great sense of satisfaction. I think I was probably more excited about the landing, that at least we landed on the moon, and we landed. It was a great thrill for that, but I guess that was more a sense of pride that we did it, and we accomplished the goal of landing a man on the moon and stepping onto the moon. It was a great thrill for all of us.
One last thing about that before I talk about Apollo 16. You lived right near Neil Armstrong in that little community you were talking about. So when he gets back and you get a chance just to, did you stand on the street with him and look up there?
No, we didn't do that.
Did you get a chance one day just afterwards, or what was the first thing he said to you, or you said to him when he got back to Earth?
They went to quarantine for 3 weeks, and so we had a debriefing. The astronaut office all went over to the quarantine facility, and they were behind the glass, and all of us astronauts outside. So it wasn't one-on-one. But we all gave him, the whole crew was there, of course, debriefing us, and we were asking questions. And Neil, it just something like, it was great. Y'all did a great job. Thanks a lot. Words like that. It's typical pilot stuff.
But I bet you had a chance, just you and him, at some point to sit and have a beer.
Yeah.
Just kind of.
Yeah. I don't remember all of those details, because after their debriefing, they had a big world tour. They were gone for, I don't know, at least 30 days, more than that. And so their whole family went.
And your buddy was never the same after that. I mean, the people just didn't leave him alone.
You're right, yeah. And he was I wouldn't call him shy, but he was very quiet guy, and he never wanted the publicity. He never took advantage professionally or monetarily on being the first man on the moon. He was just the nicest guy.
You were young when you were the CAPCOM. In fact, I guess you were the youngest astronaut to
Well, I wasn't the youngest in the office then, but I was ended up the youngest on the moon.
Yes,
yeah,
that's what I was
at 36. But this was, I was 33 when we landed in Apollo 11, and I was probably the second or third oldest guy in the room. Krantz was older, and maybe, but all the other engineers and the flight controllers were either in their 20s. So it was a young group, but very professional and very gung-ho, and man, we're going to do this. Very positive attitude.
Talk about Apollo 16. Now you land on the moon, Neil Armstrong becomes, then Apollo 16 happens, you get chosen. Talk about that day. You launch out of there.
Well, we were, our flight was one of the last 3 missions were J missions. So they were long duration lunar stays. So they had to modify the lunar module, and so they extended the schedule for a couple of years. And so instead of flying quickly after Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17 had a big quiet time in there while they prepared the lunar module. So we just kept training. So it was about a 2-year training cycle after Apollo 13 for us. It was a very focused time. We had 3 days on the moon. That meant 3 excursions on the moon, 3 moonwalks. We had a car that we had to learn how to use called the Lunar Rover. We had a big science experiments package that was Apollo, the last 3 missions really turned into science missions. And so we had a lot of experiments, a lot of geological stuff that we were doing, and so that took a lot of extra training. And so we were ready to go when we finally got the day of liftoff. John and I, you get in a spacecraft and what's going through your mind is, don't abort, don't stop, let's go, I'm ready, let's launch this thing. And so when you listen to the count, it's keep counting, keep counting, keep counting. And that's what's going through your mind after you get everything ready to go in a spacecraft. And sure enough, on our flight, we were very fortunate. We lifted off right on the 2nd. Yeah, and in Apollo, you only had like a 4-hour, we call it a window. And you wanted to launch at the beginning of that window, because if you had a problem, you get your 4 hours to fix it, and then you could launch. But after that 4 hours, the moon had rotated out of position, and you couldn't get to that point, your landing point, after that 4 hours. You had to wait a whole month till the moon came around again.
Talk about the capsule for Apollo 16. How much more advanced, or how had it changed? They changed it from Apollo 11 to Apollo 16, the capsule and the
command module, service module had a change. The command module was the same.
So give me
where
that,
we lived.
Give me that. In Apollo 11, the capsule was this.
And Apollo 11, the command module never changed. The vehicle that you rode to the moon and back. And you had a command module, a service module, and a lunar module. Well, the command module was the same for all the flights. The service module for the last 3 missions had a sim bay, we call it a bay where there was a lot of experiments. And they uncovered that, and they had cameras and seismometers. I don't know what they had back there, but they used that. They had a science mission in orbit. So he was very busy, 15, 16, and 17. On our flight, the lunar module, exterior-wise, looked the same, except bigger tanks were hung on it. They had a little structural beefing up. We had we bolted a rover on the outside of the spacecraft just to the right as you got out the door. We had a bigger experiments package, all of those things. So, but structurally and was a little stiffer, but as far as the look, you just could see bigger tanks was basically it.
Now something happened, right? You were on the surface of the moon and you decide to take an extra leap for mankind, if you will.
Well,
right?
Yeah, this was at the end of our stay, and everything had gone really, really well. We'd had over 20 hours on the lunar surface, had driven our car 25 kilometers and set the moon speed record. And so it was really, really exciting. And so we were going to end off with something special. And 1972, there was a Summer Olympics Games were in Munich. So that was in August, and we were there in April on the moon. So, well, let's kick off the Olympic year with the Moon Olympics was our idea.
Wow.
So, and John and I said, but Mission Control said, well, you're falling behind, guys. And John said, well, we're just going to do the Olympics. And so he starts bouncing, and I start bouncing. Well, up down here with all of my gear on, I weighed 363 pounds. Up on the moon, only weighed 60 pounds. But the backpack weighed as much as I did. So you see the astronauts walking on the moon, they bend over because they had to get their center of gravity over their feet. So when I jumped, I was about 3-4 feet off the moon, but I'd straightened up. So the center of gravity went backwards and over I went like that. And that was the only time I had fear in a 11-day mission. Because if I fall on that backpack wrong and it breaks, I'm dead like that. And so I rolled right, broke my fall, bounced on my back. John Young, my commander, came over, looked down and said, that wasn't very smart, Charlie. And I said, yeah, I know, help me up. So my heart was pounding, but the pressure gauge was normal. The RCU, the remote control unit, read normal. You could hear the pumps running in the back. So I knew I was okay. But then I looked up and the TV camera was pointed right at me, and they'd seen this stuff in Mission Control, and they were very, very upset. So that ended the Moon Olympics. No more Moon Olympics. You guys get back inside. It's time to come home. And even though we pleaded for 2 more hours, they said it's time to come home. So we parked the car and got back in. I dropped a picture of my family onto the moon, and I took a picture of the family, and that was one of the last things I did. And got back inside, and 3 or 4 hours later, we lifted off.
Charlie, what a life you've had.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Just sum up your life and really what Apollo means to you and the Apollo missions and what it means to us here on Earth.
Well, of course, as an astronaut, as a test pilot, I always knew the best job you could have was an astronaut job. And so I started dreaming about it when I was in graduate school in 1962 to 64 and got selected in 66. But to get selected for a moon landing position was beyond my wildest dreams. So you can imagine when my name came out and I was going to get to be one of the 12 guys to land on the moon, how excited I was. It was a fulfillment of a hard work and a dream. And the mission didn't disappoint me. It was a tremendous adventure. It was a tremendous opportunity for me to represent my country. It was a humbling experience, really. I mean, I didn't want to make a mistake and embarrass myself or embarrass our country. So we stayed focused, John and I both. And so it was, the absolute highlight of your astronaut career. And it was so excited. John and I volunteered to be backup on Apollo 17, which was really a dead-end job. But who knows, they might break a leg and we could go again. So anyway, it was a tremendous experience, and look back now, 47 years later for me, 50 years this month for Apollo 11, to have been involved in those missions was a great privilege and a humbling experience for me.
You've made the world a better place.
Well, I think I do agree. I think that the Apollo program was a great inspiration, and now, 50 years later, it's still an inspiration. I've been speaking all over the world this year, sharing this experience, and to see the reaction of the younger kids. When you consider half the world's population wasn't even born when we went to the moon. So you've got 3.5 billion people out there you can inspire. And so to see that and to see the interest in our country, as an example, NASA in 2017 had another astronaut selection. They had 18,000 applications and they picked 12. So there was not a lack of interest in that generation. And I think Apollo had a motivational aspect to that. Not only did they go to the space station, but they're the ones that are going to go back to the moon and maybe to Mars.
That's going to be happening, right? Would you like to go back to the moon?
I would go to the moon again, even at my age, but I wouldn't go to Mars. It's too long, and my age, you might die en route, or something, and so I wouldn't do that. But I'd like a trip to the moon. But to be honest, Dave, NASA says don't call us, we'll call you, and I don't think I'm going to get a call.
What an honor.
Thank you, sir. I enjoyed it.
What an honor.
Can I ask him a couple questions for you?
Well,
really quick?
I do want to ask that. I just want to ask that one question on camera.
Yeah. I got
a behind. I don't know if you can.
Yeah. Okay, just a minute. I got two questions, okay, because I got to go sign some stuff.
He just wants.
And we got a dinner at 5:30. We hadn't even checked in the hotel yet.
He wants to know what it feels like, how squishy.
It wasn't squishy. And Jack Schmidt describes it the best. It was being in 1/6 gravity is like walking on a trampoline in your spacesuit. You have this feeling of that lightness, and it's a lot of fun, but you lose your balance quickly.
All right, Charlie.
What did it sound like?
There was no sound. Of course, there was no sound on the moon between people except radio communication because there's no atmosphere. So you can't communicate voice-wise up on the moon. We had a radio. It never was quiet because you had oxygen flowing in your helmet, your hot mic. You could hear the pumps running. So it was always noisy inside the spacesuit.
And was it cold? Wow. Did the suit keep you warm?
No, you were hot in the suit. The cooling system kept you cool in the suit.
Yeah.
It was just the opposite. We got to go.
Can you just put the camera behind him one real quick second?